He paid $200 for a throwaway horse at a kill pen. Then a voicemail cracked his world open. That quiet bay gelding had once helped a grieving boy speak again. Jonah Whittaker brought him home thinking it was Mercy. But a strange mark on the hoof and a forgotten name led to late-night calls, trembling hands, and one question: keep the horse or return someone's hope before Saturday's sale erased it. The kill pen sat just outside the county key line, where the paved road thinned into cracked asphalt and finally surrendered to dirt. It was the kind of place people drove past without slowing down, the kind that didn't show up in postcards or ranch brochures. On that late summer morning, the sky over West Texas was pale and bleached, as if the sun itself had grown tired of shining too brightly on places like this. Jonah Whittaker hadn't planned to stop. He told himself that as he eased his truck onto the gravel shoulder, dust blooming around the tires, he needed hay, cheap hay, and someone had mentioned this auction yard sometimes sold surplus bales after the livestock sales wrapped up. That was all. In and out. No wandering, no looking. The moment he stepped out of the truck, the sound hit him first. Metal on metal. Hooves scraping against packed dirt. A low, restless energy that vibrated through the air like static before a storm. Jonah adjusted the brim of his old felt hat and walked toward the office, eyes fixed straight ahead, as if the rows of holding pens on either side didn't exist. He had learned, over the years, that looking was a choice. The smell followed him anyway: dust, sweat, manure, fear. It clung to the back of his throat, sharp and dry. Somewhere, a loudspeaker crackled to life, the auctioneer's voice, flat and practiced, rolling through numbers the way a man might read weather reports. Routine, efficient, detached. Jonah signed his name at the counter, exchanged a few words with a clerk who didn't bother to look up, and stepped back outside. The hay, he was told, would be available after the next lot. 15 minutes, maybe 20. He waited. At first, he focused on the horizon beyond the yard, where the land stretched out wide and empty, familiar in a way that steadied him. He thought about the repairs waiting back at the ranch, the fence post he'd meant to replace weeks ago, the quiet dinner he'd eat alone that night. Ordinary things, safe things. Then a sound cut through his thoughts, a sharp bang of the gavel, followed by movement close behind him. A gate swung open. Jonah turned despite himself. A group of horses was being moved from one pen to another, urged forward by men who'd done this 1,000 times before. Most of the animals pressed together instinctively, heads low, bodies angled inward, as if shrinking might make them invisible. Their eyes were wide, whites flashing, muscles taut with the expectation of pain or pressure. Jonah felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the instinct to step back, to disengage. That was when he saw the one that didn't move with the rest. The horse stood a few yards apart, near the back rail of the pen. Dark bay, nearly brown in the shade, ribs faintly visible beneath a dull coat. It didn't crowd forward or pin its ears. It didn't call out. It simply stood there, weight evenly balanced, neck level, watching the chaos without participating in it. There was something unsettling about that stillness. Jonah told himself it was nothing. Horses reacted differently. He had known enough of them in his life to understand that. Still, his gaze lingered. The horse shifted slightly, turning just enough that one dark eye caught the light. For a brief moment, no more than a heartbeat, it looked straight at him, not past him, not through him, at him. Jonah felt it then, a subtle but unmistakable jolt, like a memory brushing against the edge of consciousness. He broke eye contact first, annoyed with himself, and shoved his hands into the pockets of his jacket. "Don't," he muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to. The loudspeaker crackled again. Another lot number. Another gate opening. Jonah should have walked back to the office. Should have waited where he couldn't see the pens at all. Instead, he took a step closer. Then another. The horse was being moved now, guided toward the auction ring. Up close, Jonah could see the details he hadn't noticed before. A faint scar along the shoulder. Healed but old. Hooves worn unevenly, as if trimmed by someone who knew just enough to get by. The horse walked without resistance, head low but not dragging, movements careful rather than frantic. As it entered the ring, the auctioneer's voice shifted into rhythm, calling out the description with mechanical ease. Age approximate, no guarantees, sold as is. Bid started low. Jonah stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, telling himself he was only watching, that he'd leave as soon as the hay was loaded, that this wasn't his problem. A man near the front raised his hand. Another nodded. The numbers climbed slowly, then stalled. The horse stopped moving and stood in the center of the ring. Dust clung to its legs. Its ears flicked once, twice, absorbing the noise around it. Then, inexplicably, it turned its head, not toward the auctioneer, not toward the crowd, toward Jonah. There was no drama in the gesture, no panic, just recognition, or the illusion of it. Jonah's breath caught before he could stop it. He thought of all the times in his life he'd chosen the easier road, the quieter one, the moments he'd convinced himself that staying out of things was the same as doing no harm. He thought of the spaces left behind by those decisions, the silence that followed. 200, someone called out. Jonah realized with a dull sense of disbelief that the voice was his. The auctioneer paused, glanced around, and brought the gavel down. The sharp crack echoed across the yard. Sold. For a second, Jonah didn't move. Then the reality of it settled in, heavy and irreversible. The horse was led from the ring, the chain clinking softly as it passed. Jonah watched it go, heart pounding, one thought repeating louder than all the others. He had come here for hay. Instead, he had just changed something, though he didn't yet know what. Paperwork came first. It always did. Jonah stood at the counter with his wallet in hand while the clerk slid a carbon copy receipt toward him, already reaching for the next folder. The transaction was treated no differently than the sale of a trailer hitch or a stack of fence posts. Cash changed hands. A number was circled, ownership transferred without ceremony. Whatever had just happened in the ring was already being absorbed into routine. "Trailer's around back," the clerk said, voice flat. "They'll bring him out when you're ready." Jonah nodded and stepped away, the receipt folded once, then twice, before disappearing into his jacket pocket. His pulse still hadn't settled. It struck him, not for the first time that morning, how easy it was to cross a line without realizing it until you were already on the other side. Out back, the noise softened, but didn't disappear. Trucks idled, gates creaked open and shut. Somewhere, a horse let out a short, sharp call that ended as quickly as it began. Jonah backed his trailer into position, hands steady on the wheel despite the restlessness under his ribs. He climbed down and waited. When they led the horse out, it came alone. No shoving, no rope snapping tight. Just a handler walking ahead, the lead slack between them. The horse followed at a measured pace, head lowered slightly, hooves placing themselves with care. Up close, Jonah could see how narrow the animal had become through the barrel, the faint outline of ribs beneath skin dulled by dust and neglect. Yet there was no limp, no frantic resistance. Whatever strength remained in that body had been conserved, not wasted. "Easy now," the handler muttered, more out of habit than concern. The horse stopped at the base of the trailer ramp and paused. Not frozen, thinking. Its ears shifted forward, then back, taking in the hollow echo of the metal floor, the scent of old hay and sun-warmed rubber. Jonah held his breath without meaning to, resisting the urge to step forward and interfere. After a moment, the horse lifted one hoof and placed it on the ramp, then the next. It loaded itself without protest, as if this, too, was something it had done before. Jonah closed the gate behind it, hands lingering on the latch longer than necessary. For the first time since he'd spoken up in the ring, the weight of what he'd done pressed fully into him. This wasn't an abstract choice anymore. There was a living animal standing in his trailer because of it. The drive back to the ranch took just over an hour. Jonah kept his speed steady, avoiding the potholes he'd memorized over years of hauling cattle and equipment. Every so often, he checked the side mirror, watching for signs of panic or imbalance. The horse rode quietly, shifting its weight with the road, no scrambling, no pounding hooves against metal. At a red light outside a small town, Jonah caught his reflection in the windshield. Creased face, eyes darker than usual, jaw set in a way he recognized from harder days. He wondered briefly what he would say if someone asked him why he'd bought the horse. He had no answer that sounded reasonable. The ranch gate groaned open as he pulled in, the familiar sound grounding him. This land, sparse and stubborn, had been his refuge for years. He parked near the barn and climbed down, the smell of dry grass and sun-baked wood replacing the stench of the kill pen almost immediately. When he lowered the trailer gate, the horse didn't rush out. It stood there, head just visible in the shadowed interior, nostrils flaring as it took in the new space. The barn was old but clean, its beams worn smooth by time and use. Sunlight filtered in through the open doors, striping the dirt floor in gold. Jonah stepped aside, giving the horse room. "Take your time," he said quietly, the words more instinct than intention. The horse did exactly that. One careful step, then another. It paused just inside the barn, ears flicking, eyes moving slowly across the stalls, the hanging tack, the water bucket already filled. There was no fear in its posture, only caution. Awareness. Jonah led it into an empty stall, unclipped the lead, and backed away. The horse lowered its head and drank, long and deep, as if it had been waiting for water like this for longer than Jonah wanted to imagine. He watched until the bucket steadied, then turned to grab hay. When he came back, the horse was already nosing through the stall, investigating corners, memorizing boundaries. It accepted the hay without urgency, chewing methodically, conserving energy. Jonah leaned against the stall door, arms resting on the top rail. "Guess you and I both didn't plan on today," he said under his breath. The horse didn't look up, but something in its posture shifted, subtle as a breath. Jonah couldn't explain it, only felt it. This animal was not shutting down. It was taking inventory. Adjusting. As the afternoon stretched on, the ranch settled into its usual quiet. Wind moved through the scrub beyond the barn. A distant truck passed on the highway. Jonah went through the motions of his chores, but his attention kept circling back to the stall. When dusk finally crept in, painting the sky in muted oranges and purples, Jonah returned one last time before heading inside. The horse stood with its weight cocked onto one hind leg, relaxed enough to rest. Its eyes followed Jonah's movement, calm and alert. Jonah stopped just outside the stall. "I don't know what you were before," he said, not expecting an answer. "But you're safe here. For it now." The horse exhaled, a long, steady breath that seemed to empty more than lungs. Jonah stayed there a moment longer, then turned toward the house, unaware that the thought forming quietly in his mind would soon refuse to leave. This horse hadn't survived by accident. Morning came without ceremony. Pale light slid through the barn slats and settled on dust motes hanging in the air, turning them briefly into something almost gentle. Jonah woke before the alarm, the way he often did, and lay still for a moment, listening. The ranch had its own language at dawn, wind moving through dry grass, the creak of cooling wood, the distant call of a bird he never bothered to name. What caught his attention now was what wasn't there. No frantic shifting, no banging against stall walls, just quiet. He pulled on his boots and crossed the yard with a mug of coffee warming his hands. When he reached the barn, the horse was already awake. It stood near the stall door, head level, ears turning toward Jonah, as if it had been waiting. Not impatient, just aware. Jonah stopped short, surprised by the sense of being expected. "Morning," he said, his voice low and rough with sleep. The horse didn't move away. It didn't crowd forward either. It held its ground, watching him with an attention that felt measured, almost polite. Jonah set the coffee down on a bale and went about his routine, checking water, adding hay, opening the barn doors wider to let the light in. The horse followed each motion with its eyes, absorbing the rhythm of the place. As the hours passed, Jonah noticed things he hadn't the day before. The way the horse shifted its weight when Jonah reached suddenly for a tool, adjusting rather than flinching. The way it stepped back when asked, not because of pressure on the lead, but because of a subtle change in Jonah's posture. There was a responsiveness there that didn't come from fear. It came from familiarity. By mid-morning, the ranch had warmed, heat rising off the dirt in soft waves. Jonah decided to move the horse to a small turnout near the barn, nothing fancy, just a fenced patch with sparse grass and shade from a lone mesquite. He clipped on the lead and opened the stall. The horse stepped out willingly, walking beside him instead of pulling ahead. When Jonah stopped to latch the gate, it halted on its own, as if an invisible line had been drawn between them. Jonah frowned slightly, not at the horse, but at the feeling stirring in his chest. "Someone taught you manners," he murmured. Out in the turnout, the horse didn't bolt or roll. It walked the perimeter once, slow and deliberate, then lowered its head to graze, tearing at the dry grass with steady bites. Jonah leaned against the fence and watched, trying to make sense of the unease building quietly inside him. This wasn't a feral animal scraped together from neglect. This was a horse that knew how to exist around people. Later, a neighbor's kids passed by on bicycles, their laughter sharp in the still air. Jonah tensed automatically, eyes flicking to the turnout. The horse lifted its head, ears pricked toward the sound, then went back to grazing. No spook, no raised head or skittering hooves, just calm. That afternoon, as Jonah worked on a loose board near the house, a soft melody drifted across the property. Mrs. Alvarez, who lived a few parcels over, practiced piano most days, the notes carrying farther than she probably realized. Jonah paused, hammer resting against his thigh. The horse had stopped grazing. It stood facing the direction of the sound, head slightly lowered, eyes half-lidded. Not frozen, listening. When the melody shifted, the horse shifted too, adjusting its stance as if aligning itself with the rhythm. Jonah lowered the hammer slowly. "You hear that?" he said, more statement than question. The music faded after a few minutes, leaving the ranch quiet again. The horse blinked and returned to its grass, as if nothing unusual had happened. Jonah finished his work on autopilot, his thoughts circling tighter with every pass. By evening, the feeling he'd been avoiding finally took shape. This horse wasn't just calm, it was attuned. It reacted to people not as threats or tools, but as something familiar, something it understood. After supper, Jonah called the vet. It was a practical decision, he told himself. The horse needed checking anyway. Still, he found himself standing in the barn after dark, hands resting on the stall door, waiting. The vet arrived the next morning, her truck kicking up a familiar plume of dust. She worked efficiently, hands sure as she ran through her exam. Teeth, legs, back, heart, and lungs. The horse stood quietly throughout, adjusting its stance when asked, breathing steady. "Underweight," she said, straightening, "but not broken down. He's been cared for at some point." Jonah hesitated. "Anything else?" She crouched, examining the hooves more closely, then paused. "This," she said, pointing. "See that marking? Not a brand, a trim pattern. You don't see that much outside specific programs." Jonah felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of programs?" She shrugged. "Therapy work? Training facilities? Somewhere structured." When she left, the barn felt different. Charged, as if a door had cracked open somewhere Jonah hadn't known existed. He stood alone with the horse as dusk settled again, shadows lengthening across the floor. "So you weren't always just surviving," Jonah said quietly. The horse shifted closer to the stall door, close enough that Jonah could feel the warmth radiating from its body. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Whatever this animal's story was, Jonah knew one thing with certainty now: it hadn't ended at the kill pen. The questions Jonah had been pushing aside refused to stay quiet. They followed him through the next few days, settling into the rhythm of the ranch the way dust worked, its way into every crack and hinge. He fed the horse, checked the fences, repaired a sagging gate near the south pasture, but his attention kept drifting back to the stall. The vet's words replayed in his head, not loud enough to demand action, but persistent enough to change how Jonah looked at what stood in front of him. This wasn't a horse that had learned to endure by accident. Late one afternoon, Jonah brought out a bucket of warm water and a brush. He hadn't planned on grooming yet. The horse still needed weight, still needed rest, but something told him it was time. He stepped into the stall slowly, movements deliberate, giving the horse space to react. It didn't. Instead, it shifted its stance slightly, angling its body as if offering a shoulder. Jonah paused, brush midair. "You're used to this," he said quietly. As he worked the brush through the dull coat, layers of dust and dead hair came away, revealing a deeper sheen beneath. The horse stood patiently, eyes half closed, breathing slow and even. When Jonah moved toward the neck, it adjusted again, subtly repositioning itself to make the reach easier. No rope guided it, no command was spoken. Jonah's hand stilled. He knelt to check the legs more closely, running his fingers along tendons and joints. That was when he saw it clearly. The pattern the vet had pointed out, etched faintly into the hoof wall. Not a brand, not damage. A deliberate trim, grown out but still legible to someone who knew what to look for. Jonah leaned back on his heels. "Someone spent time on you," he murmured. "A lot of it." That night, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open, the glow of the screen casting pale light across the room. He typed in combinations of terms he barely understood at first: therapy horse programs, specialized hoof trims, behavioral training markers. The search results multiplied faster than he expected. He read until his coffee went cold. There were facilities scattered across several states, centers that paired horses with veterans, with children, with people carrying grief that words couldn't reach. The descriptions were careful, almost reverent. Calm temperaments, consistency, horses trained to respond to subtle cues, to stand quietly in moments that overwhelmed humans. Jonah closed the laptop slowly. The next morning he made a call. It wasn't easy finding the right person. He was transferred twice, then told to leave a message. When the return call came later that afternoon, Jonah stood in the barn to take it, eyes on the horse as it shifted in the light. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman who sounded tired but attentive. "You said you found a horse with a therapy trim?" she asked. "Can you describe him?" Jonah did. The color, the scar, the calm, the way the horse reacted to music. There was a pause, longer than Jonah expected. "That sounds like one of ours," she said finally. "Or It sounds like what one of ours used to be. Jonah felt his grip tighten on the phone. Used to be? Our center shut down a little over a year ago, she said. Funding fell through. Some of the horses were rehomed properly. Others... She hesitated. Others disappeared before we could place them. Jonah swallowed. Do you have a name? Yes, she said. He was called Harbor. The word landed heavier than Jonah had expected. He repeated it once, softly. Harbor. After the call ended, Jonah stayed where he was, phone still pressed to his ear, long after the line went dead. The horse lifted its head and looked at him, ears flicking forward, as if sensing the shift in the air. Harbor, Jonah said aloud. The horse didn't react dramatically. It didn't rear or whinny. It simply blinked, slow and deliberate, then took a step closer to the stall door. Jonah exhaled through his nose, a sound halfway between a laugh and something else entirely. That evening he sat on the edge of the stall and told the horse what he knew, not because he believed it understood the words, but because the act of speaking made the truth feel real. He talked about the center, about the people who might have stood where he was standing now, about the possibility that this animal had once been more than just a body moving through space. You weren't meant to end where I found you, Jonah said. The horse shifted its weight and lowered its head, breath warm against Jonah's sleeve. For the first time since that morning at the kill pen, Jonah allowed himself to think the unthinkable, that buying the horse hadn't been the end of the story, but the middle of it, and that somewhere beyond the fences of his quiet ranch there might be someone who had been waiting without knowing what they were waiting for. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Jonah lay awake, listening to the slow ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional creak of the house settling into the cooler hours. The name lingered in his mind, refusing to fade the way most thoughts eventually did. Harbor. It wasn't just a label. It felt like a doorway that had been opened without his permission. Before sunrise, Jonah was already up. He made coffee he barely tasted and walked out to the barn while the sky was still a deep, unbroken blue. Harbor stood as Jonah approached, ears turning toward the sound of his boots on packed dirt. There was something different now, not in the horse's behavior, but in Jonah's awareness. He wasn't looking at a stray purchase anymore. He was looking at the aftermath of a decision made somewhere else, long before that auction. Jonah rested his forearms on the stall door and exhaled slowly. Harbor, he said again, testing the sound of it in the quiet. The horse lifted its head, not sharply, but with a subtle attentiveness Jonah hadn't noticed before. It didn't react the way a trained animal might respond to a command. It simply acknowledged the sound, as if recognizing it as something that belonged. Later that morning, Jonah made another call. This time he reached the woman from the center again, her voice weary but patient, as she filled in the pieces he hadn't known to ask about the night before. Harbor had been paired with children dealing with grief and trauma. He wasn't flashy or dramatic. He was steady, reliable, the kind of presence that didn't demand attention but offered it without condition. There was one boy in particular, she said, hesitating before continuing. He connected with Harbor in a way that surprised everyone. Jonah leaned against the barn wall, phone pressed to his ear, eyes fixed on the horse as it shifted in the sunlight. What happened to him? Jonah asked. The woman sighed softly. His name's Noah. He lost his mother in a car accident. For months afterward, he barely spoke. Harbor was the first thing he'd stand near without shutting down. They spent hours together, quiet hours. Jonah closed his eyes. And when the center closed, he asked. We lost track of Harbor during the transition, she said. Noah's family was devastated. Losing the horse felt like losing her all over again. When the call ended, Jonah stayed where he was long after the line went dead. The pieces were fitting together now, and he didn't like the picture they formed. He thought of the kill pen, of how close Harbor had come to disappearing entirely, not just from one family's life, but from the world. By midday, Jonah's phone rang again. This time, it was an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Whitaker?" a man's voice asked carefully. "Yes." "This is Daniel Hayes. I'm Noah's father." Jonah straightened, his grip tightening instinctively. "I got your number from the center," the man continued. "They said you might have Harbor." Jonah didn't answer right away. He looked at the horse, now standing quietly in the shade, tail swishing lazily. "Yes," Jonah said finally, "I do." There was silence on the other end of the line, the kind filled with restrained emotion rather than uncertainty. Is he alive?" Daniel asked. Jonah swallowed. "He is. He's thin, but he's safe." A sound escaped the man on the other end, something between a breath and a laugh that broke under its own weight. "Noah's going to want to see him," Daniel said, "even if it's just a picture." He never stopped talking about that horse. After the call, Jonah stood motionless for several minutes, phone hanging loosely at his side. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't anticipated voices, expectations, history attaching themselves to the quiet space he'd been living in. That afternoon, he cleaned Harbor carefully, brushing until the coat showed hints of its original depth, filling water buckets, checking feed measurements twice. He took a few photos when the light was right. Nothing staged, nothing dramatic. Just Harbor standing in the stall, head over the door, eyes calm. When Jonah sent the images, the response came quickly. A short message first, then a longer one. Then a call request Jonah let ring twice before answering. Noah didn't speak much on the screen. He didn't have to. His eyes widened when Harbor came into view, and his hands trembled as he pressed them together in his lap. "That's him," the boy whispered. "I knew it." Jonah felt his throat tighten, the sound of the barn fading into the background. "I'm taking care of him," Jonah said gently. "He's going to be okay." That night, Jonah sat alone at the kitchen table long after dark, staring at the receipt still folded in his jacket pocket. $200. The number felt absurd now, stripped of its original meaning. He understood something then that he hadn't at the auction, or even during the quiet days that followed. Saving Harbor hadn't been the end of the responsibility. It had only made the rest of it unavoidable. The days that followed settled into an uneasy balance, as if the ranch itself were holding its breath. Jonah went through his routines with the same discipline he always had, feeding at dawn, checking fences, repairing what the wind and heat wore down. But everything felt subtly altered. Each task carried an awareness he couldn't shake. Harbor was no longer just under his care. He belonged to a story that extended beyond the property lines, beyond Jonah's control. Daniel called again 2 days later. This time, he didn't circle the subject. "We can cover everything," he said carefully. "Feed, vet work, transport, whatever you've spent, we'll reimburse, and more, if that's what it takes." Noah just wants him home. Jonah stood in the barn doorway as he listened, watching Harbor nose through his hay with steady patience. Sunlight spilled across the stall floor, catching in the dust stirred by each quiet movement. "I'm not asking to keep him," Jonah said, "but he's not ready to travel yet." There was a pause. Jonah could hear someone moving in the background on Daniel's end, the muffled sound of a house with other lives in it. "What do you mean?" Daniel asked. "He's been through too much," Jonah replied. "Another long haul right now could set him back. He needs time. A few weeks, maybe more." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Of course," he said. "We understand whatever Harbor needs." Then came the part Jonah hadn't expected. "And when he is ready," Daniel continued, voice measured, We want to do right by you. Harbor means everything to Noah. We're prepared to pay for that." Jonah closed his eyes. He'd known this moment was coming. Ever since the first call, ever since he'd seen Noah's face light up on the screen, the question had been waiting, quiet but inevitable. Ownership. Compensation. The unspoken assumption that everything eventually had a price. Jonah looked down at his hands, scarred, calloused, shaped by years of work that rarely earned praise or recognition. He thought about the night he'd stood in the kill pen, convincing himself he was just buying hay. He thought about the empty rooms in his house, about the things he'd lost and learned to live without. "I didn't buy him to sell him," Jonah said finally, "not to anyone." Daniel didn't interrupt. "He's yours," Jonah continued. "He always was. I'm just holding him until he can go back." Silence stretched between them. Jonah wondered if he'd said too much or not enough. When Daniel spoke again, his voice was thick with something Jonah recognized instantly. Relief edged with gratitude. "Thank you," Daniel said. "I don't know how to explain to you what this means to my son." Jonah swallowed. "You don't have to." After the call ended, Jonah remained where he was, phone still in his hand, listening to the quiet return to the barn. Harbor lifted his head, chewing slowly, as if aware that something had shifted again. Jonah stepped into the stall, resting his forearm lightly against the doorframe. "You hear all that?" he asked the horse softly. "People making plans for you." Harbor flicked an ear in his direction, then went back to eating. Over the next week, Jonah noticed the change in himself more than in the horse. He paid closer attention to Harbor's condition, measuring feed carefully, adjusting turnout time based on the heat. He kept notes, weight estimates, appetite, small observations that might matter later. It felt less like ownership now and more like stewardship. In the evenings, Noah began sending short voice messages instead of texts. They were hesitant at first, just a few words at a time. "How's Harbor today?" "Did he eat all his hay?" "I miss him." Jonah listened to each one in the barn, sometimes playing them twice. Harbor reacted every time, not with excitement, but with a quiet focus, ears turning toward the sound as if it carried weight beyond the words themselves. One evening, Jonah replied with a message of his own. He didn't plan it. The words came out before he had time to reconsider. "He's doing good," Jonah said into the phone. "Strong, calm. He remembers you." After he sent it, Jonah sat on an overturned bucket and stared at the stall wall, the truth of that last sentence settling slowly in his chest. Because Harbor did remember. Not in a way Jonah could explain with logic or training manuals, but in the way the horse stood closer to the barn door during those messages, in the way his breathing slowed, his posture softened. Whatever bond had existed before hadn't disappeared. It had only been interrupted. Later that night, Jonah walked the fence line under a sky thick with stars. The land stretched out, vast and indifferent, the same as it had always been. Yet Jonah felt different moving through it now, as if the boundaries he'd drawn around his life were shifting. He stopped near the far pasture and leaned against a post, looking back toward the barn where a single light glowed softly. Some things aren't meant to be owned, he thought. They're meant to be carried for a while, then returned. For the first time since the auction, Jonah felt certain of what he was doing, not because it was easy, not because it was expected, but because it was right. Time began to stretch in a different way after that, no longer measured only by sunrises and feed buckets, but by small signs of progress that Jonah learned to notice without trying. Harbor filled out slowly, not dramatically, not in the way before and after photos like to advertise, but in increments that revealed themselves only if you paid attention. The curve of muscle returning along his neck, the steadier placement of his hind feet, the way his coat started to catch the light instead of swallowing it. Jonah adjusted his routines without thinking much about it. He rose earlier to beat the heat, led Harbor out later in the evenings when the air cooled, and stayed longer in the barn than necessary, leaning on the stall door while dusk softened the edges of everything. The ranch felt less like a place he managed and more like something he shared. Noah's messages became a constant presence. Sometimes they came in the morning before school, sometimes late at night, when Jonah guessed sleep hadn't come easily on the other end either. The boy didn't always ask questions. Often he just talked about a math test, about a dream he'd had, about how the house felt quieter without Harbor's steady breathing in the background. Jonah never rushed those messages. He listened to each one in the barn, letting the sound carry across the stall. Harbor responded every time, not by moving closer or making a sound, but by changing. His ears would settle forward, his posture easing as if the air itself had grown more familiar. One afternoon, Jonah decided to read the messages aloud instead of playing them through the phone speaker. His voice felt awkward at first, too loud in the enclosed space, but Harbor didn't flinch. He stood quietly, head angled toward Jonah, listening in the way he always did, completely. Jonah cleared his throat and kept reading. Something shifted then, not suddenly, but unmistakably. The act of waiting, of holding space instead of rushing toward an ending, began to feel purposeful. Jonah stopped counting days and started counting moments. How long Harbor could stay focused during grooming, how calmly he handled the farrier's visit, how easily he accepted changes without tension. Daniel called less often, trusting the updates Jonah sent. When he did call, his voice carried a steadier tone than before. "Noah's talking more," he said one evening, "about school, about the future, about Harbor." Jonah glanced at the stall as he listened, watching Harbor nose his hay aside in search of the softer strands beneath. "That's good," Jonah said. "It is," Daniel agreed. "I think knowing Harbor's safe." It gave him something solid to hold on to. That night, Jonah walked the property line again, the same path he'd followed countless times before. The stars were sharp overhead, the land quiet and vast. He thought about how easily things could have gone differently, how close Harbor had come to vanishing without a trace, how thin the line was between loss and recovery. Back at the barn, Jonah paused before turning out the light. Harbor stood near the door, relaxed, one hind leg resting. Jonah rested his hand against the wood, close enough to feel the warmth of the animal on the other side. "You're getting stronger," Jonah said softly, "and so is he." Harbor lifted his head, meeting Jonah's gaze through the slats. There was no urgency there, no question, just patience. Waiting, Jonah realized, wasn't empty time. It was work of a different kind, the kind that didn't leave calluses on your hands, but still asked something from you. Restraint, trust, the willingness to let a story unfold at its own pace. As Jonah turned off the light and stepped back into the night, he knew the hardest part wasn't bringing Harbor home from the kill pen. It was learning how to let go without turning away. The message came on a Wednesday afternoon, short and careful, like Daniel was afraid to jinx it by sounding too hopeful. "Noah wants to come this weekend. If your vet says Harbor can travel, we'll be there Saturday morning." Jonah read it twice, then set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stared out the window at the yard. A thin wind moved the brush along the fence line. The barn sat in the same place it always had, sun-bleached boards and familiar shadows. But the idea of someone else stepping into that space made Jonah's stomach tighten. He didn't answer right away. He walked to the barn instead, because that was where his thoughts went when they got too heavy to hold. Harbor was in the turnout, grazing with a patience that felt almost deliberate. When Jonah approached, the horse lifted his head, ears turning forward, and watched him like he'd been watching him since the first night, quietly, steadily, as if waiting for Jonah to catch up to what was already true. Jonah leaned against the fence. "Looks like you've got company coming," he said. Harbor blinked once and went back to grazing. The vet came the next morning, clipboard in hand, businesslike as always. She checked Harbor's weight, listened to his lungs, watched him walk a straight line in the dust. She asked Jonah how long the haul would be, whether the family had a decent trailer, whether they planned to stop for water. Jonah answered the questions like a man trying to keep it practical, even as his chest tightened with each one. "He can travel," she said finally. "But keep it calm, breaks every few hours, and make sure you've got the paperwork squared. Away, health certificate, Coggins, all of it." Jonah nodded. Already working on it. That part was easier than the feeling. Paperwork didn't ask him to admit what he was about to lose. It didn't look at him with quiet eyes from behind stall bars. On Friday evening, Jonah cleaned the stall like he was preparing it for a show, even though no one would call it that. He swept the aisle, replaced old bedding, scrubbed the water bucket until it shone. He brushed Harbor until the coat caught the last of the light in long, dark waves, and the scar on the shoulder looked less like damage and more like a line in a story. When he finished, Jonah stepped back, arms hanging at his sides. "You're not going to make this easy," he said softly. Harbor lowered his head and breathed out, warm and steady, as if the only answer he had was patience. Saturday morning arrived clear and bright. The air held a hint of change, summer thinning into something sharper, while the sky stayed wide and indifferent. Jonah woke before dawn, and he found himself standing in the barn before the first real light reached the rafters. Harbor stood quietly, as if he'd known. Jonah didn't speak much. He just checked the latch twice, set out water, and waited. At 8:47, tires crunched on the gravel driveway. Jonah stepped outside and watched a pickup roll in, road dust coating the sides. A horse trailer followed behind it, clean, well-maintained, the kind you could tell someone had budgeted for carefully, maybe trimming other expenses, maybe arguing with a loan officer or switching auto insurance to make it work. The truck stopped near the barn, engine ticking as it cooled. Daniel Hayes climbed out first. He looked older than his voice had sounded on the phone, or maybe worry just did that to people. He shut the door and stood for a second, scanning the property like he was trying to understand the place that had held his son's hope for weeks. Then the passenger door opened. Noah stepped down slowly. He was smaller than Jonah had expected, narrow-shouldered in an oversized hoodie despite the warming day. He held a folded piece of paper in one hand, so tightly the edges were creased. His eyes moved from the barn to Jonah and back again, cautious, not afraid exactly, more like he was standing on the edge of something too important to rush. Daniel walked around the truck. "Mr. Whitaker?" he asked, offering his hand. "Jonah," Jonah said, shaking it. Daniel's grip was firm, but Jonah felt the slight tremor beneath it, the way a man holds himself together when he can't afford to fall apart. "Thank you," Daniel said, and there was nothing rehearsed about it. Jonah nodded once. "He's in the barn." Noah didn't move right away. He just stared at the open doorway, where cool shade lived behind sunlight. Jonah saw Daniel glance down at his son, saw the silent question in his face. "Are you okay? Are you ready?" Noah swallowed and took one step forward, then another. Jonah led them in without making a speech. The barn swallowed the outside noise the way it always did, leaving only the soft creak of wood and the faint rustle of hay. Harbor stood in the stall, head lifted, ears forward, body still, not tense, alert in a way that made the air feel charged. Noah stopped at the stall door. For a second, it looked like he might not breathe at all. His hand rose halfway, then faltered, hovering over the top rail without touching. Jonah expected words, something from Daniel, something from Jonah himself, but the moment demanded quiet. Harbor moved first. He stepped forward, one hoof at a time, slow and steady, as if any sudden motion might break whatever fragile bridge had formed between them. He came right up to the door and paused, nose inches from Noah's chest. Noah's face crumpled in a way that didn't need explanation. "It's you," he whispered, the words so soft they barely existed. "It's really you." Harbor lowered his head. Noah leaned in as if pulled by something stronger than fear, and he pressed his forehead against Harbor's neck. He didn't hug the way people do in movies. He just rested there, small body against warm muscle, like he'd finally found the only place that made sense. Harbor didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He stood like a harbor does, steady, unmoving, while a storm finally had somewhere to end. Daniel's breath hitched behind Jonah, sharp and helpless. Jonah didn't turn, because he knew if he saw Daniel's face, he'd feel it all twice as hard. Noah's hand found Harbor's cheek, fingers trembling. "I thought you were gone," he said, and the words came out broken but real. I kept waiting." Harbor's ears flicked once, then settled forward again. He let out a long, low breath that sounded like relief. Jonah felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't realized he'd been holding tight since the day he said 200 out loud. They stayed like that for a long time. Jonah stepped back to give them space, leaning against a post in the aisle. The barn light shifted as the sun climbed, turning dust into gold. Daniel wiped at his face with the heel of his hand, embarrassed by nothing except being seen. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. "Noah," he said gently, "we should get him loaded." Noah nodded but didn't let go right away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded paper. He held it up for Jonah to see, then offered it like a careful gift. "I wrote him something," Noah said. Jonah took the paper with both hands. "You want me to read it?" he asked. Noah nodded once. Jonah opened it slowly. The handwriting was uneven. Letters crowded together like the writer had fought to get them onto the page before courage ran out. "Dear Harbor," it began, and Jonah's throat tightened. He read the rest quietly, voice steady only because he refused to let it shake. It was a child's voice. Truth, simple, direct, devastating. It said Harbor made the world feel less loud. It said Noah was sorry he couldn't protect him. It said thank you for coming back. When Jonah finished, he folded the paper carefully and handed it to Daniel. Daniel pressed it to his chest for a second, like he didn't know what else to do with something that mattered that much. Loading Harbor took less effort than Jonah expected. The horse followed Noah out of the stall with calm steps, stopping when Noah stopped, walking when Noah walked. At the trailer ramp, Harbor paused, ears flicking, then stepped up without hesitation. Noah rested a hand on Harbor's neck as the horse entered the trailer. "We're going home," he whispered, as if testing whether saying it aloud would make it real. Jonah latched the door, the metal click sounding louder than it should have. Daniel approached Jonah with an envelope in his hand. Jonah saw it and shook his head before Daniel could speak. "Don't," Jonah said. Daniel's jaw tightened. "We have to," he said quietly. "Vet bills, feed, your time. This matters." Jonah kept his voice even. "Use it for him," he said. "Therapy, school, whatever makes the nights easier." Daniel stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once, the way a man agrees when he knows arguing would only cheapen the moment. "Then let me do one thing," Daniel said, pulling a business card from his wallet. "My number's on there. If you ever need anything, legal questions, hauling contacts, insurance headaches, whatever, call me. You didn't just return a horse. You gave my son something back." Jonah took the card. "All right," he said, because refusing that felt like refusing gratitude itself. Noah climbed into the truck and looked back through the rear window at the trailer. Jonah could see his face in profile, eyes fixed on the small framed opening where Harbor's head would appear. The truck rolled forward slowly, dust rising behind the tires. Jonah stood in the driveway, hat brim casting shadow over his eyes, watching until the vehicle reached the gate. For one last second, Harbor's face appeared in the trailer window, calm, steady, then shifted away, following Noah's voice as Daniel pulled onto the road. Jonah remained where he was after the sound faded, the dust settling back onto the gravel like a quiet ending. Jonah stayed in the driveway long after the truck was gone, as if the air might carry the sound back if he listened hard enough. The quiet that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that made every small noise feel too sharp, the distant rattle of a loose gate latch, the soft scrape of wind across dry grass, his own breathing inside his chest. Eventually, he turned and walked toward the barn. Inside, the aisle looked the same as it had all week. Broom leaned in the corner, a coil of rope hanging from a peg, sunlight slanting through the open doors. But the space felt altered, as if the building itself had noticed the absence and didn't know what to do with it. Jonah's boots sounded louder on the packed dirt than they ever had when Harbor was here. He stopped at the stall. The water bucket was still full. The hay net hung half empty, a few strands spilling out like someone had left in a hurry. There were faint hoof marks pressed into the bedding, softened already by time, but still there if you looked closely. Jonah rested his hand on the door and stared at the empty corner where Harbor had liked to stand, head angled just enough to see the aisle without being in it. He waited for the familiar movement, the quiet lift of ears, the soft shift of weight, the steady breath he'd grown used to hearing even when he wasn't paying attention. Nothing came. Jonah stepped inside and reached down, fingers closing around a single dark hair caught on the latch. He didn't know why he picked it up. He didn't know why it mattered. But he held it between thumb and forefinger for a moment, then tucked it into his shirt pocket like it was something that belonged there. On the stall wall, the sunlight fell in a rectangle, bright enough to show faint scuffs where a body had leaned. Jonah stood in that light and felt the strange mix that came after doing the right thing. Relief braided with loss, pride braided with grief. People talked about kindness like it was clean, like it didn't cost anything. Jonah knew better now. Kindness could leave a room empty. He walked out and shut the stall door, the latch clicking into place with a finality he didn't like. At the house, he tried to eat lunch, but the food tasted like nothing. He washed the plate, dried it, set it back in the cabinet. Then he found himself at the kitchen table with his laptop open, staring at the business card Daniel had given him. If you ever need anything, insurance headaches, hauling contacts. Jonah had almost laughed at the phrase when Daniel said it. Jonah didn't have headaches like that. He kept his life small on purpose. But the card sat there now, a quiet reminder that his choices were touching other lives, whether he wanted them to or not. Without thinking too much, Jonah typed a few searches that felt unfamiliar in his ranch-worn hands. Equine insurance, farm liability coverage, veterinary care costs, feed costs per month, horse transport requirements. The results filled the screen with numbers and policies and fine print. It was all practical, all reasonable, all the things Jonah usually respected. And yet, as he read, his mind kept drifting back to the yard outside the county line, the pens, the noise, the stillness in Harbor's eyes before Jonah spoke up. He closed the laptop and stared out the window again. The afternoon sun made the land look harsher than it did at dawn. The fence posts cast thin shadows like tally marks across the dirt. Jonah thought about Harbor's body when he first stepped out of the trailer. How little there was to him, and how much had still been present in the way he carried himself. Jonah thought about the other horses he'd glimpsed in that place, the ones who pressed against each other without understanding why, the ones whose eyes had already gone dull. He didn't let himself picture endings. He didn't have to. He already knew what it looked like when the world moved on without you. A notification chimed softly on his phone. Jonah glanced down, expecting a text from a neighbor about a stray calf or a gate left open. Instead, it was a voicemail from an unknown number. He pressed play. Noah's voice came through, hesitant at first, then clearer as he kept going. "Hi, Jonah," the boy said. "Dad said I could call. Harbor's here. He ate when we stopped. He drank water. He's okay." There was a short pause, like Noah had to gather himself. "Thank you, He swallowed audibly. "Thank you for not leaving him there." The message ended with the faint sound of Daniel prompting something in the background, and then a soft click. Jonah didn't move for a long time. He played it again, slower this time, not because he hadn't understood it, but because it felt like proof that something real had happened here, that the emptiness in the barn was not just absence, but aftermath. He stood and went back outside. The barn greeted him with the same quiet, but it didn't feel as hollow as before. Jonah walked to the empty stall and leaned his forearms on the door. The habit was so ingrained now that his body did it without asking permission. He stared into the space and let Noah's words settle in the corners, like dust that wasn't unpleasant. Outside, the faint piano melody drifted across from Mrs. Alvarez's house, a few notes at a time, an unfinished song, a practice run. Jonah listened until the tune found its shape, then lost it again. He thought about Harbor's reaction to those notes, the stillness, the listening, the way the horse seemed to make room for sound without demanding anything from it. Jonah reached for a scrap of wood from a nearby workbench, the kind he'd used to patch a fence. He found a marker, hesitated, then wrote slowly, his letters plain and unadorned. Temporary shelter. He held the sign up, looked at it as if it belonged to someone else, then nailed it above the stall door. The hammer strikes rang through the barn, each one echoing once before fading. When he finished, he stepped back. The words looked small against the old boards, but they changed the stall anyway. They changed the way Jonah saw it. Not as a place something had ended, but as a place something could pass through, something that needed a pause, a breath, a steady hand. A truck engine sounded in the distance. Jonah glanced toward the road, half expecting Daniel's trailer to come back, half expecting to feel foolish for hoping. The sound moved on, swallowed by the wide-open land. Jonah returned his gaze to the sign. He realized then that Harbor's story wasn't just about a horse finding his way home. It was about a man learning, too late maybe, but learning anyway, that a home could be more than what you kept. A home could be what you offered. That night, Jonah didn't turn off the barn light right away. He left it glowing softly, as if the empty stall might feel less empty with a little warmth nearby. He sat on an overturned bucket in the aisle and listened to the ranch settle around him. He didn't make promises. Jonah Whitaker wasn't a man who spoke in big declarations. But in the quiet, under the wooden beams and the lingering smell of hay, he understood something that hadn't been clear to him on the day he paid $200. Harbor hadn't just been saved. He had revealed the kind of work Jonah could no longer pretend wasn't his. The next morning, Jonah didn't take the barn light down the way he normally would when day came. He left it on a little longer, watching how the soft glow rested against the fresh board he'd nailed above the stall. Temporary shelter. The letters looked almost stubborn in the quiet, like they had decided to stay whether Jonah was ready or not. He brewed coffee and didn't sit at the table. Instead, he stood at the counter with his phone in his hand, thumb hovering over Daniel's contact like a man about to step onto unfamiliar ground. Jonah had spent years keeping life simple on purpose. Fewer complications, fewer people, fewer reasons to hope too hard. But Harbor had cracked something open, and it wouldn't close just because the stall was empty. When Daniel answered, his voice sounded brighter than Jonah expected. "Jonah," he said, I was just about to call you. We got in last night. Harbor settled in like he never left." Jonah exhaled slowly, feeling a quiet relief settle into his ribs. "Noah okay?" Jonah asked. There was a small laugh on the other end, soft and exhausted. "He fell asleep on the couch with Harbor's halter in his lap," Daniel said. "He hasn't done that, fallen asleep without a fight, since before everything happened." Jonah swallowed. "I'm glad." Daniel grew quiet for a beat, then spoke carefully, like he was choosing his words with both hands. "So," Daniel said, "what now?" Jonah looked out the window at the land stretching away, sun already bleaching the horizon. He could have said the obvious, that life went back to normal, that the ranch returned to being what it had always been. But the stall sign was still in his mind, and the sound of Noah's voicemail still sat somewhere deep in his chest. "I don't think I can pretend I didn't see what I saw," Jonah said. "That place, those pens." Daniel didn't rush him. Jonah continued, voice low. "I can't save them all, I know that. But I keep thinking about the ones that don't make it to someone's driveway, the ones that never get a second chance." A long pause followed, long enough for Jonah to hear the faint background noise of Daniel's house, a cabinet shutting, a floorboard creaking, real life happening around Hope. Then Daniel said, "Tell me what you need." Jonah almost said nothing. Old habits clawed at him. He didn't ask for help. He didn't borrow trouble. But he thought about the searches on his laptop, equine insurance, liability coverage, the way numbers multiplied into impossibilities if you tried to do it alone. He thought about how Harbor had been safe because Jonah had happened to be there with $200 in his pocket, and how much of the world ran on luck when it shouldn't. "I need it to be real," Jonah said finally, "not a one-time thing. If I do this again, I have to do it right. Vet care, feed, transport. I need to make sure it doesn't fall apart the first time something goes wrong." Daniel's answer came without hesitation. "Okay," he said. "I have a friend who's an accountant. We'll talk about a proper setup, an LLC, a nonprofit path. What makes sense? We can make donations tax-deductible when the time comes." And Jonah, "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because Noah keeps saying a sentence I can't forget." Jonah's throat tightened. "What sentence?" Daniel's voice softened. "He keeps telling people a stranger didn't leave him there." Jonah closed his eyes. Over the next few weeks, Jonah's ranch changed in small, practical ways before it changed in big ones. He fixed the broken latch on the west gate. He replaced rotting boards in the stall row. He built an extra water line so buckets didn't have to be hauled by hand in the heat. He sat on the phone with the vet's office arranging a discounted schedule for basic checkups. He called an insurance agent and listened to the language of risk and protection like it was a new dialect he had to learn fast. Daniel followed through, too, quietly, efficiently. He didn't announce anything on social media like some people might. He didn't chase credit. He helped Jonah build a foundation under the impulse that had once been just a man raising his hand in an auction ring. Then, one late afternoon, Jonah's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He answered on the second ring. "Jonah Whitaker." A familiar voice came through. "Oh, one of the yard hands from the auction lot." "It's Troy," the man said. "You bought that bay gelding off us a while back, the one you hauled out like it mattered." Jonah's stomach tightened. "Yeah, what about it?" Troy cleared his throat. "Listen, there's a mare here. Chestnut. White blaze, been standing quiet all day, not causing trouble, not making noise. People don't like quiet ones. They don't know what to do with them." Jonah stared at the barn door, at the light glowing faintly inside, even though day hadn't fully faded yet. You calling me because you want me to buy her? Jonah asked. Troy hesitated. I'm calling you because she reminds me of that one you took, he said, and because you asked me that day where the hay was, like you weren't even here for the horses. Then you walked out with one anyway. Made me think, maybe there's a chance for this one too. Jonah didn't speak for a moment. He could hear the pen noise behind Troy, metal, distant voices, the restless shuffle of hooves. He didn't need the sound to picture it. He already carried that place in him now. What's the timeline? Jonah asked. Troy exhaled. Morning sale, he said. After that, I don't know. Jonah looked toward the empty stall. The sign above it didn't glow, but it might as well have. I'll be there, Jonah said. When he hung up, he didn't feel heroic. He felt scared. Not of the mare, not of the yard, but of the widening circle his life was becoming. Purpose asked for more than good intentions. It asked for follow-through. He pulled his trailer out and checked every latch like his hands had done it 1,000 times, because they had. But this time he also packed a small first aid kit, extra water jugs, a halter that wasn't frayed, paperwork folders Daniel had helped him set up. The work had a shape now. On the drive, the sky turned the color of old brass. The land flattened out, scrub and fences sliding by like a slow film reel. Jonah's mind kept returning to Noah's letter, the way Harbor had stood with his head lowered while a boy's grief finally had somewhere to rest. Jonah didn't know who this mare was. He didn't know what story she carried. But he knew what it meant when something quiet kept standing anyway. At the auction yard, the air hit him like a memory he didn't want. Dust, noise, that same dull heaviness. Jonah walked past the office without lingering and headed for the pens, scanning faces and bodies until Troy's hand lifted in a quick signal. She's there, Troy said, pointing. The mare stood near the back rail, chestnut coat sun-faded, blazed bright against her face like a candle in dim light. Her ribs showed. Her mane was tangled. But her eyes were awake, watching, calculating the world without surrendering to it. Jonah stopped at the fence. The mare turned her head slowly, and their gaze met across the rail. Jonah felt the now familiar tightening in his chest, not because he wanted another horse, not because he needed to prove anything, but because the choice in front of him wasn't really a choice anymore. It was a continuation. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing the folded receipt he still carried out of habit, then the business card Daniel had given him, then the new folder he'd labeled in plain ink, Temporary Shelter. Jonah turned to Troy. What's her lot number? Troy blinked, then swallowed. Lot 12, he said. Jonah nodded once, like a man stepping into a role he hadn't auditioned for but couldn't refuse. As the mare was moved toward the ring, Jonah followed, not rushing, not dramatizing it. He knew the moment the auctioneer's voice rose into that practiced rhythm, he would raise his hand if he had to. Not because he believed he could fix a broken system by himself, but because he had learned the one truth Harbor left behind in an empty stall. Sometimes a life changes because one person refuses to look away. If Harbor's story moved you, leave a comment with one word: hope, home, or healing, and tell me why you chose it. Read a few comments and share this video with someone who needs a second chance today. If you want more true feeling rescue stories like this, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.